everybody. Welcome to Women Are. It's a panel show with creative professionals talking about their amazing and wonderful careers and experiences. I'm Felicia Day. I'm the host, and this is my channel. You might be familiar with me because I'm here a lot. And I'm very excited about this week's panel on storytellers. We have 8 episodes, and this is the second to last. And I did want to put it as one of the last ones because I admire these women so much. They are not only incredible writers, novelists, storytellers, but they're amazing communicators. So I think we're going to have a hard time getting everything done in an hour and 5 minutes, but we will try. As always, we are going to be giving a $750 to charity for every single one of these hangouts. So this week is Right Girl. It is a nonprofit organization in LA that promotes creativity and self-expression to empower girls. I have actually volunteered a lot with this charity before things got really busy. I was actually a mentor for a lot of girls, and it's amazing the difference the organization makes in their life. It really has created a lot of professional creators and writers in the industry of Hollywood, but also writers from girls in very underprivileged backgrounds. They have like 100% graduation rate, I think, with the girls they mentor. So it's truly an amazing organization. So if you're thinking about charities this year, definitely check it out. I have so many wonderful people I admire on this panel today, new and old, of what I know in person from a long time ago, and people I've been introduced to recently, and I'm so excited to get to them. I'm going to introduce them by name, and then I'm going to ask you guys to tell the audience just a little bit about yourself before we get into some panel questions, starting with V.E. Schwab. Victoria, would you mind telling the audience a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm Victoria Schwab. I also write as V.E. Schwab. I'm the author of, I think, 20 books at this point about life and death and the weird lines between the amorphous world. I tend to write dark fantasy, both for middle grade, teenagers, and adults.
20 books. That is incredible. Like, I want to talk a little bit about output because I have a lot of scraps of projects that if I get one in my lifetime, it'll be lucky. But we'll talk about that later. Fonda Lee, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Fonda Lee. I do not have 20 books out yet, but I have 6.
Yet.
And I'm the author of the Greenbone Saga, which is an epic Asian-inspired urban fantasy about a gangster family with magic, rocks, and kung fu. And also, I'm the author of several young adult science fiction novels. I write both YA and adult and science fiction and fantasy. And the Greenbone Saga is currently in development as a TV show.
Amazing. I think we're going to hear that story over and over with all of these authors because they created such amazing worlds. Our next guest is Charlie Jane Anders. Charlie Jane, can you introduce yourself to the audience?
Hi, I'm Charlie Jane Anders. I'm the author of, a handful of books. I wrote a book called All the Birds in the Sky, which came out like 5 years ago, and The City in the Middle of the Night came out last year. I have a young adult novel, Victory is Greater Than Death, coming out next April, and I'm also doing a collection of essays about how to get through hard times by making up stories, and you can read them all online at tor.com. It's called Never Say You Can't Survive. I think the final one's going up tomorrow.
I've read a couple of them, and they are so inspiring and wonderful. As someone who's written a book on creativity, I would highly recommend you guys, especially since it's NaNoWriMo, and a lot of people are struggling with their creativity right now because it's hump day in NaNoWriMo. So definitely get in there, read those essays, and pre-order her YA book because the cover is, I don't know what's in it, but the cover is behind her, and it's sold it to myself to me instantly. So it's gorgeous. And last but not least, Tracy Dion. Tracy, I was introduced to you by Charlie because I said, who should I put on the panel? And Tracy, I'm in love with you. I am almost finished with your book. It's amazing. I cannot wait to read more. Can you please introduce yourself to the audience?
Absolutely. And also big shout out to Charlie Jane because she's amazing. So my name's Tracy, and I am the author of a book called Legendborn. It's my debut novel. It's a YA contemporary fantasy that is Southern Black girl magic meets a reimagining of King Arthur in the South. It deals with grief and racism and history and sexism, and there's sword fights and magic beings and also a lot of Welsh. And I'm working on the sequel right now, which is very exciting and super scary. And the book that came out last week that I'm most excited to talk about is from from a certain point of view, The Empire Strikes Back. It's the 40th anniversary anthology with 40 authors, and I have a story in this anthology where I write several thousand words from the perspective of the cave on Dagobah, and that was a lot of fun. I can't believe they let me do that.
Oh my God.
I was also a consulting producer and featured on Looking for Leia, which is a docuseries that premiered on Sci-Fi, talking about fandom and how fandom and how women in particular and non-binary fans have been sort of like owning the joint of fandom for like 30 years.
It's incredible. Like, as you can tell, I'm in love with all of you. I'm in love with all your work. And if you haven't read any or any of these, one of these women, if you've not read all their books, please pick them up, because it truly is an honor. I have to tell you, okay, I meet a lot of famous people, but the only people I geek out over are authors. So if you created a world in a book, I literally start sweating. I'm sweating right now. So I'm very, very excited. I just want to talk a little bit briefly. A lot of our audience are aspiring storytellers themselves. So a lot of our questions are going to be kind of along those lines. And I also, from a personal point of view, I just want to hear how you guys' creativity works. So just throwing it out there, how did you know you guys knew you were going to be a writer? Was this like a straight line for you, or is this a curvy one that kind of brought you into the world of writing as your self-expression? Charlie Jane, you want to start?
Sure. I mean, my origin story as a writer is basically like, when I was a little kid, I had a learning disability. I almost flunked out of first, second, and third grade because I just couldn't do any of the work. Like, my brain just wasn't capable of doing anything. And I had this one special education teacher who kind of helped me to figure it out. And the way that she helped me was partly like she got me to write down stories and make up stories. So pretty much I've always dealt with life by kind of making up stories and kind of losing myself in my own imaginary world, like a lot of like weird geeky outcast people. And I feel like, I tried journalism, I kind of dabbled in acting, but I feel like writing was always the only way that I could really get that hit of just like being lost in another world.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, that sort of, I will tell you, I wish I had started writing earlier, but I was a homeschool kid, and I relate with what you say, because I literally would take the characters in books I loved and put them in a spreadsheet about how they all related to each other. So like Perry Mason lived in the same world as Trixie Belden.
Makes
and
total sense.
Doc Savage, and it was a really cool town, you guys. Anyway, Fonda, what is your? I know that was so awkward. Fonda, what is your Earnest origin story as a writer?
So writing's my second career. I started out wanting to be a writer when I was 10 years old, and I had this super long bus ride that was like 45 minutes, and I was really bored. I didn't have like a Game Boy or anything. So I just wrote stories. I was a huge science fiction fantasy geek when I was a kid, and was always that child who wanted to be left in the library until closing time. So I made up the story about dragons and a bunch of magic creatures on this quest, and I wrote like 300 pages when I was in 5th grade, just on line paper.
Wow.
So that was my first novel. I was like, I'm going to be a novelist. So I did that, and then I guess reality struck at some point, and I was like, no, like I should get a real job. And I think part of the part of the things that one of the things we can talk about is like whether or not at what point you like realize that like creativity is a calling or a real job, because I never imagined that it was something that I could do as a profession. And part of that was the fact that I'd never really seen role models. I didn't know any writers. I certainly didn't see any Asian American fantasy authors. So I went off and had a practical career in corporate strategy and planning. And I did that for a number of years. And then I hit this point in my life where my hobby, which was writing, I was always writing fan fiction and fiction of my own for myself, fell to the wayside because I was so busy with the rest of my life that I didn't have time for it anymore. And then that's when I realized that it was something I needed to do, that it was like oxygen. And I had to have this epiphany where I realized, no, like I'm not getting younger, and I really want to make this a priority in my life. And I rearranged a bunch of stuff in my career to be able to finally pursue it.
Mm-hmm. That totally makes sense to me when you talk about that. I mean, I feel like when you have creativity in your life, but when you need it, but you don't have it, you feel like an empty pierogi or like an empty empanada. And so you have structurally what you need in life, but there's nothing inside. And you're like, just give me some chicken, or just put some spinach inside me. You know, exactly that analogy, right, Fonda?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely gonna compare my life to an empanada from now on.
Tracy, I read from your bio that you also have a performance background. Now,
Yeah.
was it a straight shot? Did you do a lot of writing of your own material before then, or were you more just a performer and then decided to dive in? How did you get in the writing side of it?
So I think, I started out writing when I was 9 years old, and I think this is a good opportunity to talk about this. The reason I took it seriously was because my mother, who was a single mother, and I'm an only child, took it super seriously. Like I finished a short story and she was like, okay, this is important. We're going to have to copyright this and we're going to have to submit it to, and I remember being like, what are you talking about? And I remember feeling embarrassed and like, no, mom, let's not do that. We don't make a big deal. Like, why are you doing that? And looking back, I'm like, she was endorsing that in product and saying, this is real, you can do this. And I look back on it and I'm like, that was pivotal, actually. Even though my 9-year-old self was like, no, it's not a big deal. And I don't know. I think it's really important to have somebody like that in your life. So my mother definitely was the first person to take it seriously. I was writing like angsty poetry in middle school, like one does. And I think I got into creative writing in college and then transferred over into a degree called performance studies, which is sort of an anthropology / theatrical hybrid degree where you do a lot of adaptation. So actually I spent like probably 3 or 4 years just adapting like poems or novels or comic books to the stage. And that degree sort of posits that the adaptation process helps you better understand both the writer and the story itself, which I think is true. So I wrote scripts and I wrote a theater like script, a play for half of my thesis, along with like an academic paper, and directed it for my master's thesis. And it was about Superman and identity and trickster figures. And they let me do this to get a master's degree. It was very, looking back, I'm like, okay. But yeah, so I think I was like always telling stories. And then after that, I ended up working in casual video game production, co-writing casual video games. There's an REO Speedwagon hidden object game out there with my name on it.
What? REO Speedwagon?
Yeah. I was a producer, but like, that's how you learn story, you know, like you figure out where it works. That was an interactive story. That was like, how can we make hidden object storytelling feeling
with REO Speedwagon themes? Did you were you a fan, or did you have to become a fan?
Well, see, it was like the peak of like the edutainment, whatever period. And so everyone wanted an app and everyone wanted a game, and ours was like, we're going to do this. And I had an opportunity to meet them and I couldn't make it to the concert, but I remember being like, what would I say?
You'd say nothing.
Because I wasn't a fan. Like,
I can't fight this feeling anymore.
Yes.
Sorry, I couldn't resist.
Yeah. So then after video games, I sort of found my way back to fiction through fan fiction, and then was like, hey, like I really like writing. Let me see if I could actually focus on that. What would happen? What would happen if I actually focused on that? And so here I am. But so
New York Times bestseller. That's what happens, right?
Like, but you know, I think that sense of like, I'm just going to tell stories is what really kept me afloat for a long time. Because I could see how thinking of myself as a novelist before I was ready to do that would probably have made me too scared and I would have just stopped, you know, like how you can think yourself into a wall and just be like, I'm not that, so I guess I can't do it. But I kept finding ways to keep being creative in small ways. So I'm grateful for that.
It's a big commitment to do a book, and having written 2 nonfiction, and I'm too chicken to do a real novel, a fiction novel. I like to tell a fiction book. I'd like to say my editor hates me for saying that word. But I think we have the opposite end of the spectrum with Victoria, who has done 20. So you're like a slip and slide of creativity. Let's hear about you, and also segue into process. And you guys feel free to jump in when we talk about process, about like how you guys work. Victoria, how do you do 20 books? Like,
well, okay, so I do
24, by the way. So
they're all like, they're not all this size, right? So I've written for middle grades. So for like the 10 to 12, I've written graphic novels. I have 3 of those. So that's the only way it hits 20. It's 17 if you don't count graphic novels, which for some reason my father doesn't. So my father believes I have written 17 books. I would like to insist I have written 20. But no, I much like Tracy, like I started in bad poetry. I was really deathly afraid of writing a novel, but I hadn't figured it out yet. So all through high school, I made things up. I love telling stories, but they had to be in short format. So it was like poetry, short fictions, like mini screenplays. And it wasn't until I was a sophomore in college that I realized the reason I hadn't written a novel yet was because I was terrified of failing to write a novel. But I have this super adversarial relationship to fear. Like when I realized I had a fear of heights, the first thing I did when I turned 18 was go skydiving. And when I realized I had a fear of change, I chopped off all my hair. I had a fear of needles, so I got tattoos. Like, so when I was 19 and I realized I had a fear of failing to finish something, I sat down and I started writing a novel. And I wrote my first novel at 19, and it was, I feel like I should say, terrible. Like genuinely terrible, as a first novel that anyone has ever written should absolutely be. But the act of hitting the end is the most addictive experience I have ever had. And so because I came from poetry, that book actually had enough cadence and kind of style to it. No substance, really should just emphasize no substance, but enough style, it got me a literary agent. And that book would spend the next year and a half on submission to publishers, going to acquisitions, that final threshold again and again and again, at which point everyone would realize it was not a good book. And so I was a senior, and I kind of, Fonda, had the same experience of you, kind of like that moment where you veer towards adulthood and you're like, I will choose the practical path, except I didn't. I have like a very keen memory of, I was 6 majors in at that point because I really didn't want to pick, and like in so doing unpick other choices. But I was a second semester senior. I realized that book I wrote was not going to sell. I realized I could either carry on with my education, graduate, go to graduate school, come back to this thing I love maybe 10 to 20 years later, or I needed to like get out of my seat in that moment, go to the nearest coffee shop and spend 2 hours a night writing a new book, because I had to prove to myself I wasn't a fluke. And so what I did was, for the last semester of my undergraduate year, I spent 2 hours every single night in a coffee shop from 9 to 11 p.m. when it closed. And sometimes I would write 100 words and sometimes I would write 2,000, but I made space. And much like Tracy, I took it seriously before anybody paid me to take it seriously. I made time for it. So many people will say, I don't have time. You never have time. You have to make time. And so I made time for it. And I finished the novel that would become my first published novel the week of graduation. And it sold September 2nd for almost no money and no fanfare. But from that moment, I thought, I have a foot in this door. I will do whatever it takes to stay in this room. I will do work for hire, where a publisher comes to you and says, like, we need a thing. I will find ways to do graphic design for other authors. Like I wanted to find a way, like tooth and nail, to make it work. And so that's like 11 years later and 20 books later. And I will say the first like 6 to 7 was not like a just easy slip and slide skating along, but I just became relentless.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. How did each of you kind of feel about what has been most crucial? Like obviously grit has just been crucial for you, just your sheer personality. What other, and then a couple, like Charlie Jane mentions a mentor, you know, when in your grade school or whatever, you have these pivotal either moments or things or classes you take. What are those, and how did that kind of like help you get on the train of like, I can do this?
So I'll say personally, for me, a huge turning point was when I started treating it like a job. And the thing about writing is that, like, for a long time, it is a job that pays no money. And it is like a full-time job that pays no money. So you have to transition like your mindset into thinking of yourself as a writer very gradually. And there's no benchmark at which somebody says, congratulations, you are now a writer. It's not. And I came from a corporate background where you could expect that after a certain amount of time, you would get a promotion. After a certain amount of time, you would get a raise, like you would get this degree, and then you would officially be, you know, certified in some way. But with writing, that never happens. And so those milestones have to happen in your own mind. And I think there was a period in which I would go, to introduce myself in a social situation, and I wasn't sure whether to call myself a writer or not, because, maybe I had an agent, but I wasn't published yet, or I had a book deal, but I wasn't published yet, or I had like one book, but maybe I didn't have a second book yet. So like, could I call myself a writer yet? And that mindset transition kind of happened over a period of time where, I would start saying like, well, I do this, but, oh, I also write. Until you reached a point where you would introduce yourself as I'm a writer. And that's something that I think we talk about imposter syndrome a lot, right? In the creative community. But I think it comes because we're so used to external validation. In most other careers in our society, there is an external validation factor. And, in ours, there's publication, but that can be like years down the road from the point at which you start thinking of yourself as a writer, a professional writer.
Mm-hmm. No, it is. It is a cycle. It's a psychological thing. And I would like to actually address it as a gender thing. Not that, pardon me. I mean, I can't tell you how many white guys I've seen come into in a Hollywood meeting. I'm a screenwriter. I've never sold anything, but they say they're a screenwriter, right? And so that inherent confidence with men, I think when little boys are raised, they do have this sort of entitlement to claim a title before maybe they're ready, or just claim it and go after it in a more aggressive way. Whereas women are discouraged more like that in society to be bold and put their name forth. I don't know if that's been an experience for you guys in your lives.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just nodding. I'm like, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, I have 2 New York Times bestselling books. They're nonfiction, but I don't call myself a writer. I mean, I'm like, I can't call myself a writer, but I write every day. I don't know. Yeah. It's a sort of imposter syndrome that really, and Tracy, you being a performer, does that help your confidence? Is it almost like you could adopt the role of being a writer before you got to the point where you feel like, I've sold a book and all that stuff? Or was it more of the backward situation that Fonda's talking about?
I think it's interesting. So I started public speaking when I was like 10, and have been public speaking for most of my life for various reasons. And so I'm really good at sounding good at what I do. And I think that makes it worse, because then I know like my imposter syndrome is like, well, I like talk a big game. I look like a writer. I know how to like talk about writing, but then when I sit down at my keyboard, I still have so much fear, like I still have imposter syndrome. So I don't know that the performance helps, because that only to me sort of reinforces the outward performance of being an author and being a writer. And I will say that I do think that being public about being a writer is definitely a gender thing as well. Like, I think that I think about the types of writers that when I was growing up that I felt like were just like out there doing things. And a lot of times it was just dudes. And then I would go back and read their book and not be into it at all. And be like, oh, okay, there's a disconnect between like the performance of authorship or whatever, and publishing reinforces that in a lot of ways. And then actually like sitting down and being like, okay, is their craft progressing? Do I see this person growing from book to book? So I think that the performance of, especially now, and especially with social media, the performance of being a writer and author is like a whole different discussion.
Absolutely. I mean, that's something that Charlie Jane, I think, is the master of. Like ever since IO9, you are like a connector. And I admire that so much. Everybody here, you have 10 people, you recommend people, you really put yourself out there for other people. With your Writers with Drinks, Drinks with Writers, like it really is
Writers
wonderful.
with Drinks.
Yeah, Writers with Drinks. And just, I want to hear a little bit about your journey, because you did all of that. And then you started doing novels. Were your novels in progress while you were doing the blog and the other coverage? I mean, I remember you at an EW party with a microphone, and I'm like, she's too serious for this. Why is she here?
Oh my God. Yeah, those EW parties. That was my hell. Every year, those EW parties were my hell. Because, okay, just sidebar.
No, do it.
Sidebar. Every year at Comic-Con, you basically don't sleep for 5 days. You're getting up at like 5 a.m. because you got to get in line. You got to go interview Jeff Bridges at like 6 a.m. or whatever. And like, seriously. And then you get to the end of it, and Saturday night, you just want to like die. And they're like, okay, stand here at this red carpet with a microphone. Random celebrities will walk past. You don't know who they're going to be. ask them questions. Just ask them just come up with questions on the spot to ask random celebrities who walk by. And you're like,
So
I
bad.
haven't slept in 5 days. No, I don't know. For me, it was, my experience was a little bit different from like Victoria's. Was I was struggling. I was a struggling writer for a very long time. Like before I started doing IO9, before any of that, I was writing novels. I wrote a bunch of novels that were never published. I wrote a bunch of short stories that were never published.
Wow.
I had a bunch of short stories published in really tiny, small press magazines that you would never have heard of. And like one of my first published short stories was in like one of those free newspapers that they give out that have like ads for strippers that are basically like all the content is just there for the stripper ads. And I was like, I got a piece of fiction published. Like nobody's gonna read it, but it was published in like, it was an Arizona stripper newspaper that published science fiction, like in Arizona. And like some horny dudes in Arizona maybe read my story. I don't know.
I hope so. I hope so.
Phoenix. So I was a struggling writer for a very long time. And it was really important to me. Two things were really important to me. One was to know in my own kind of heart, my own mind, that being a novelist was my career and that everything else was just my day job. And that included IO9. When I started working at IO9, I actually had conversations where I was like, look, writing fiction is still my day job, it's still my career, and this is my day job. And of course, IO9 was a day job that took 12 hours a day a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And then I would write fiction in my spare time after that. I just didn't sleep much for 9 years. That's how I wrote All the Birds in the Sky, basically, and like 3 or 4 other novels during that time that nobody ever saw. The other thing that was really important to me, that was community, and like having a community of writers and like having those connections to other writers and having spaces where people could share their stuff, and like going to literary events. And Writers with Drinks was really my attempt to bring people together and build bridges. Like, not to get too, I don't want to go on and on, but Writers with Drinks, like it was like every genre that I could smush together into an event. It was every type of writer, it was every community. And my goal with that was always to, and I hope I get to do Writers with Drinks again one day, I really miss it, but it was like this raucous event in a bar. Fonda read at Writers with Drinks.
Oh yeah,
you
invited me a couple of times and I could not go, and I always regret that.
I highly recommend it.
Yeah, and it was just, but the point of it was to kind of break down these barriers and to bring people together. If you like mystery novelists, here's a poet, here's a science fiction writer, here's a literary person, and just like, get rid of some of the snobbery, some of the status obsession, and just have community. Because I feel like writing can be very solitary, and the more we are doing it as a communal activity, the better it is.
Yeah, no, it feels very isolating. And that's actually because all of you seem fairly extroverted as people. And no, oh no, the look on Victoria's face is like, no.
The performance. I will lie in a fetal position on the floor for the next 6 hours and speak to no one. But yes. Yeah.
I mean, you're all dynamic. Your presence is so dynamic. It feels hard to imagine that you've chosen a career where you kind of have to lock yourself away. Do you guys get lonely? How as a novelist do you kind of get that input that kind of gets you over those humps? Or is it just sheer willpower? Like Victoria, is it sheer willpower, grit?
I don't get lonely. I just I love, don't get me wrong, I love having the opportunity to go out and meet readers. Like reader interaction is the thing that helps combat the extraordinary fatigue of going out to meet those readers. Yeah. And that's beautiful. But like, I'm somebody who is happiest at my computer where there are fewer voices in my head and in my ear. Like, I love to just go to places in the middle of nowhere and have time. Like, for me, writing and being an author with a capital A are two very different professions. And I like both of them, but never the twain shall meet. Like, there are times when I am writing and there are times when I'm promoting. And when I'm promoting, I love it and I embrace it, but I don't get to write during those times. I don't know about the rest of you.
No, it's exhausting. I mean, I guess you did go, you recently had a book tour, correct? And was it as exhausting as it kind of seemed when I actually was your interviewer in one of it? Yeah, I was so honored. Yeah.
It was the worst. I mean, no, it was the best and you were wonderful, but it was like, but I also went from being in 17 countries last year, which was its own kind of exhausting, to doing virtual events this year wherein there's no audience feedback. Yeah. So for like 14 nights, it was me. And because I'm in France, it was like 2 a.m. and like quick drag from here up and just like trying to pretend like this is all normal when it's just you and me and God knows who else. And so it's a very different kind of tiring, but I will admit at least there's less travel.
Yeah, that's true. There's nothing worse than an airport when you go on a book tour. I think I've never hated anything more than going through security 2 times a day. Sometimes I just feel like, wow, I can feel the cancers growing in me right now.
Well, and also forgetting what city you're in. Like you really do hit a point on tour where you get off a plane and you're like, I genuinely have no concept of where I am.
Yeah. Tracy, are you doing any press or virtual events or anything for your Empire? I want to hear more about this actually. So how did you get involved in this Empire Strikes Back situation, and how is it working for a big company that kind of owns the IP? I guess that's a good, how does that work for you?
I'm going to flash it up on screen because the cover is just like gorgeous and it's got gold foil and it just came out last week. So I feel like it's
very
my
beautiful
diligence to be like, look at the book.
Mm-hmm.
But honestly, it was, so one of the editors approached my agent, and I think I had already put out into the like publishing world vibe, like if they ever show up, the answer is going to be yes. And so they were like, would you like to be part of this anthology? And you can pick, who you want to write. And, you kind of like hands off the main 3, Luke, Leia, and Han, and then other people will have picked some before you. What do you want to do? And so, yeah, it is kind of strange because, you're writing for Star Wars / The Mouse. And there's this like feeling of like, wow, there's just a lot of, approvals that have to go into this. So my story group and Lucasfilm Story Group is like epic in my mind, for someone who likes watching stories go over different formats. As someone who has done that in her life, I really just love the idea of Story Group as a functional and creative space, but it's intimidating because it's like, okay, well, they could totally shoot this idea down, or they could say like, that's too much. And I definitely did get notes back that were like, you're maybe pushing the Force in a direction that's cool, but we're not gonna let you
okay with it. Yeah.
Or like, you can't say that, or like, let's not be so specific. Let's like keep it light. Like there were some really interesting sort of challenges, I think, when they're holding literally continuity of like so many different aspects of this massive universe.
Yeah.
But it was great too, because sometimes I would get a note back and I'd be like, well, but in season 6 of episode 13 of Clone Wars, this happens, and like, but you're trying to write it really politely. Just be like, oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah, I'm so excited for that. You're like, excuse me.
Yeah, exactly. Like to be like, okay, but in the Age of Resistance Snoke comic, on this page, this thing gets said. So like, I totally got to do that. And it was nerve-wracking. But as someone who's a fan, as someone who's like actually really enjoys the idea of playing inside canon when we're inside canon and playing outside of canon when we're outside of canon, like I really wanted to make it work. But that moment was probably a highlight in my career, to be like, I'm not pushing back, I'm pushing it alongside by making this point.
Yeah, it's interesting because and I would like to talk to the whole panel. Has anybody written fan fiction, and was it kind of like that, or was it more like I'm having to work? Because I've adapted. I wrote a pilot for Red Sonja for Bryan Singer. Sorry, but I adapted that, and it was so fun because they really let me do whatever I wanted. And I'm really proud of the script. Things happened that nothing ever happened with it, but I loved playing in that world because it felt like I was free. But I've had other experiences where I was pitching IP and they were like, oh, you can't do all that. They very much shoot down your love. And then like, it becomes more of a like, well, what will you let me to do? So how is that line between fan fiction and working for IP, if anybody else has experienced that? Or if you've just written fan fiction and how awesome that was.
I mean, I can say just like from someone who just did it, fan fiction is one of those things where I can write a fanfic and nobody could see it, and it'll still be doing the work that I wanted it to do. And like, I can still have satisfaction out of that thing. When you publish fan fiction, really, like anybody could be reading it and somebody will love your weird story. That's the nature of the internet, is that someone's going to come along and be like, your headcanon is my life. But there's like freedom in that, and that's really exciting. And like IP, from my one experience so far with Star Wars, although I guess the REO Speedwagon was kind of like
That is insane to
kind
me.
of IP work actually. But I think respecting other people's boundaries in terms of the playground, I don't think feels bad when I know that that's what I'm going in to do. And I haven't had it, luckily so far, I haven't had an experience where I felt like someone was trying to extract the heart of what I was trying to do from their story. They were just giving me some like bumpers about what I could push on. And I feel like as long as that's happening, but I don't know, I haven't written enough IP. So someone else tell me if you feel like the heart of your story was getting pulled out by.
Yeah, well, Charlie Jane, I don't know. I don't know if you could say you were working in the writer's room on a TV show based on IP. I don't know if you could say anything about it, but how was that experience? If you need to be vague about what you were working on, and if you want to be specific, that's okay. But how was that experience in the collaborative environment of a TV show? And how is that different from being a novelist? And do you like it or not? Or is it horrible?
Yeah, I was in the writer's room on season 1 of Y the Last Man, which is filming in Toronto now. It was finally got to start filming after a lot of delays. And that was an amazing experience, in large part because Eliza Clark, the showrunner, who I know is a friend of yours, Felicia,
she's a wonderful person.
An amazing person and just so incredibly generous and like just so thoughtful and so good at like bringing together this group of writers and listening to all of our input, but not letting anybody derail anything, and just creating this really collaborative kind of respectful atmosphere where everybody is listening and everybody's kind of wanting to make it the best thing that we can possibly make it. And, I mean, when you're dealing with a comic book that came out like 20 years ago, and there's a lot that could be changed or improved, or I think even Brian K. Vaughan and Pia Guerra would agree that there's room for improvement and room for
it feels
updating
dated in a lot of ways. Yeah, for me, I mean, I read it, probably 5 years ago, and even then I was like, I don't know about this.
Yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful comic. I loved it when it came out. It definitely had some room for improvement and some things that needed to be updated, I think. And we mostly were trying to keep the heart of what we liked about the story. While, and I can't get into what we did and any of that stuff because it's way, way, way above my pay grade. I'm like basically just like a peon kind of in the salt mines. But it was just really like, it was my second writer's room experience. I was also in a writer's room a few years earlier. And it was just really just great to be part of like a team of really cool, smart people making something happen. And then, it was great to be able to return to my own thing and be like, empress of my own domain and like whatever I decide goes. Like it was kind of nice to be able to return to my own kind of stuff after that. But it was such a fun experience. And I think that there's a difference between IP where it's like Star Wars, where like there's something kind of sacred about Star Wars. It's huge, it's sprawling, and certain things about it are just like iconic in the public consciousness. And most other IP, including not just Y the Last Man, but like Red Sonja or whatever else, people are familiar with it, people love it, but there's a lot more
for
room
reinvention,
to kind of, there's a lot more that you can do with it before people are like, oh my God, that's sacred or whatever.
Yeah, and absolutely.
I would be very intimidated if I had to work on like something that was like that level of iconic, I think.
Yeah, even like I see, The Witcher, like I'm especially I think video game people are super, super, super possessive over their worlds. And so I'm kind of heartened that The Witcher kind of got a backhand thumbs up from some people. And I think Resident Evil could be good. Video games are so spotty in translation that I feel like a lot of the books are better than the TV and movies adaptations because you have the room that a video game would take in a book, right? Fonda and Victoria, you guys are now working on adapting your own IP for television. How is that process going for you? Victoria, I want to hear, you are supposed to be in the writer's room right now, and I want to thank you for dipping out.
I know, I'm ducked out of the writer's room for this specifically. Well, also, I was thinking I'm kind of in a weird position on this one. So I have a Netflix show called First Kill. We're about halfway through the writer's room right now, which is very exciting. It's like a very gay Buffy meets Killing Eve, basically like the queer teen girl drama that I wanted when I was younger. But it's weird because it's based on a short story. So the short story really carries us through the pilot, but it wasn't a whole novel where we had to work towards adapting a 500-page book to a single season. So I was really like, as the show creator and one of the writers in the room, I'm the jumping off point. But
Yeah.
it's nice because I kind of feel like I have the best of both worlds, and that I don't have to be too possessive because there's a limited amount of material that I could have been possessive about. Like I was possessive about the pilot because it really stayed true to the short story. But from there, I'm working, with 8 incredibly talented minds who are infusing life into a world that I had just begun to create.
Mm-hmm.
And the counterpoint to that is that I adapted The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, my latest novel, and adapting for feature, like a book into a feature, was so much harder because it was like, how do I cook up this meal 2 ways?
Wow.
And have it still, like Charlie Jane said, have the same heart and soul, if not the same details.
You're so close to it, right? You've lived
Yeah.
with that book for 9 years. I think you
Yeah.
told me it took 9 years to write that book, which is incredible.
Right.
But also, like, how do you separate yourself from your baby? I'm like, okay, go off with it. I can't fathom it.
Well,
Weird, but I
I'm
will
struggling
also
with that
say-
right now. So
Oh, good.
I'm the exact situation where I've written these 3 novels. The first 2 are out, Jade City and Jade War. The 3rd and final volume will come out next year. And that'll
Heavy
be Big
breathing.
Fantasy.
Heavy
And-
breathing. I can't wait. It's gonna be so
And
good.
when it's all done, I mean, it'll be like 3/4 of a million words and like a lot of years of my life spent in this fictional world. And so I'm very emotionally invested in it and very tied to it. And it's going through an adaptation process now. We're still very early on. It's pilot script situation at the moment. But because of that, I struggle with how much to be involved or not. And it is it's this balancing game that I have to play of knowing that like I want this to still maintain the heart and soul of it, and I trust the team to do that, and I want to be involved, but at the same time letting go of it and realizing that it's a different medium, it's a different writer's fingerprints, it'll be its own thing, and letting go of that is tough too, because when I write a novel, I have complete control of it, but the pacing of a novel is very different from an episodic TV show. And the show has to be modified in order to fit and to work within, these new constraints. And so there's a lot of cool things that are a part of it. And as a creator, I think you go through letting go of your work in stages, right? There's a stage where you hand it off to your editor, right? And you're like, okay, like I've handed it off, and it's going to come back with all this feedback, and you'll have to work to make it stronger. And then there's the letting go of it once it's published and it's no longer yours anymore. And readers will interpret it in ways that sometimes you just completely do not expect, and you have no control over that.
Yeah.
And they can interpret it and misinterpret it and have these wild debates about it. And you have to kind of just be like, ooh, like hold still, biting your nails. And then there's the process of other creators taking over. And I think it's all fantastic and wonderful. And it's great to see that happening.
But it's so hard. I feel like
it's hard. It's like sending your children off into the world.
But it's also like Jell-O, and I don't know if you any feedback whatsoever. It's okay to have the right feedback, but then when you start getting so much feedback, it's like the reverberations just make you shake so much. It's like what I don't have any center anymore. I don't know where I am, because you just get caught up in the back and forth of it, and then you lose a compass. And I guess for me, like always having either that other person in your life to be your advocate, like, because you will get shaken as a creator so much. And, that's very different in novels. I at least in what I know and experience, that your editor is there to make your vision the best that it can be, versus like studio people are like, I need to be the best version that I need it to be. Right. And so that's a real differentiator in a sense.
Well, Felicia, there's like something I wanted to say to that, which is that I feel like your agent often and your editor in publishing want to be those advocates, but sometimes publishing shakes you too, right? Sometimes publishing shakes that Jell-O mold really roughly, and I feel like it does it in more subtle ways than studios, which are just like, your Jell-O is worthless, goodbye. But I feel like it can be like, there are times I feel like we should talk about, in case there are aspiring writers watching, where like absolutely in publishing they'll try and shake your foundation. You start wondering like, what is my name worth? Like, is it you know, am I doing the right thing? Am I, and like, how am I building all of these different things? And like, the most important thing that ever happened in my career early on was a failure. I had a publisher decide to cancel one of my series. And like,
Wow.
shook the jello straight off the table, right? But I feel like it's important because that course correction, that moment where you start reassembling your foundation, that is like the choices that you make moving forward, right? So I feel like there's nothing that can happen that prevents you from putting the jello back together again, like as long as you have the fortitude to last with your jello. But that I think that like, yeah, something will always come along in the studio or the publishing system to test how strong the plate that the jello is on.
No, that's a wonderful analogy, because when you're a creative person, you have a bright, beautiful idea and you want to share it with the world. And I actually want to talk about, how do you know that idea is worth anything? Well, you have to have the self-confidence to be like, this is worth a year of my life. This is the idea, even through the hard times, that it's going to be, I will be happy with myself once it's done and out in the world, right? And how do you guys sort of settle on that idea? Because you're creative people. I'm sure you have 15 ideas a day, right? And you write them down in the notebook and you're like, okay, great. Yeah, a shape-shifting panda. That could be a cool one. How do you know which, is that, yeah, exactly. How do you know which one needs to be grown and nurtured and watered? And when do you know, have you ever abandoned an idea? I said a baby, but like, there are babies. Have you ever abandoned a baby in the middle of it? You're like, this will not work. Has anybody ever done that?
I have plenty of stories where I got halfway through and I was like, it's not really, I'm not really feeling it anymore, or I got to step back and think about this. The ideas that I really commit to, the ones that like really kind of need to be kind of developed into a full, giant shape-shifting panda baby thing, are the ones that just kind of stick in my mind, and I keep thinking about them and I keep being like, oh, but what about this? Okay, but how about this? And like, for me, I'm a big believer in like, the more I brainstorm on something and the more I kind of poke at it and the more I kind of like question it, and like the more I ask, what is it about this idea that's speaking to me personally, and why am I so invested in it? And what is this thing about my own personal life and obsessions and stuff that I can kind of bring to it as a story? I feel like that process is part of how I figure out that an idea is worth doing, but also how I get excited about it. And this is something I've been writing about in those essays, is like, the more I question it, the more I take it apart, the more I kind of like poke at it, the more excited I get, the more I feel like people are often afraid to kind of question or, interrogate or dismantle or poke at their ideas too much, because they're like, oh, I'll ruin the magic. But for me, that is the magic. The magic is interrogating it and questioning it.
Well, I completely agree with that.
Yeah,
and I think, there's oftentimes in your career when you have all these voices of like, what should I write next? Like, what's going to sell well, what's going to build my brand, what's going to, make my editor happy, like all those voices. But the thing to remember is like, this project that you're working on, you have to live with it for years. And you have to, not just the writing and the editing and the publication and the promoting. I mean, by the end of it, even if you love it when you begin, you're going to be sick of it. Like, there's going to be times when you're like, I want to just light this whole thing on fire. So in order to have the fortitude to live with this thing for that long and be that invested in it, it has to be something that you love unreservedly, like regardless of what anyone else tells you should be writing. And I agree with Charlie Jane, the ideas that I end up working on are the ones that won't leave my mind. Like, there's always, something about that just sticks around and I can't kind of shake it. And I've said before, like, go with the idea that makes you want to pee your pants a little because it's so exciting to you. Like, there's got to be like a cool factor there that you're like, this is just like, it's too cool to resist. And if I don't write it, like, I'm going to regret it. And that's how you know that it's something that will get you through all the times that you want to light your hard drive on fire.
That's a fascinating, I really love that comment about what should I write or what will be received well. That is a constant struggle for me as a creator, because of kind of getting shot to the top and having a certain reputation and being perceived as something. And then you feed the thing versus feed yourself, right? Especially having a company, I was always thinking about what audience needed. And that was the reverse of what I needed as a person. And that's why, it's taken years of therapy, quite frankly, to get back to the point where I'm like, I have an idea and I'm really excited about it. And I can't let it go for no apparent reason other than I actually just want to work on it. And I can't tell you the struggle to get back to those roots. But I think people don't tell you, yeah, we're all struggling. When you get success, that trap becomes so much because so many people have a stake in your success. They just want you to mine you for success over and over again. And you can't really withdraw into yourself if you're not super, super strong to be able to say, no, I don't need you to use me right now. I need to figure out how to let myself, breathe in a sense. And I don't know if you guys have had that pressure of success to follow up with equal success in the same vein and felt kind of stifled about it. Have any of you experienced that?
Oh gosh, no. No. Yes. Hell yes. No, absolutely. I mean, I think it comes with the territory. And, I really made an effort after All the Birds in the Sky to do a book that was as different as I possibly could so that I wouldn't feel like I was, getting just like, you're going to always get this thing from Charlie Jane. It's just this thing over and over again. And I wanted to make sure that I was still challenging myself and doing things that were new to me and that I wasn't sure I could pull off. Mm-hmm. And, it's scary. It's really scary.
It's a lot of risk.
Terrifying.
Yeah. It's a lot of risk but it's also a lot more rewarding, right? But when your creativity becomes commodity, then you're thinking, oh, I got to pay the bills. I've got to keep this going, or I'll be like that one writer we saw at that one con who did one thing and then they never, you have all these sort of external things going on. And yeah, I guess it's just going back and always kind of knowing yourself each step of the way as you grow to make sure you're in touch with who you are.
And I think Fonda put it perfectly too, which is that we live with our stories for a lot longer, for a long period of time before the reader does. And so making sure that we stay creatively fulfilled is one of the most important parts in terms of that creative well of the process. And so, for some, that means playing in one sandbox for a very long time and making it deeper and wider until it's a full beach. But for me, I like to make every one of my books, like Charlie Jane was saying, as different as possible. I never want to do the same thing twice. For one, because I don't want to get bored, but two is absolutely self-preservation. If I don't write two books that are similar, people cannot compare them. And I don't want people to be able to hold up two of my books side by side and be like, this one is better at X than this one. I'm like, well, neither one of them is going to be X then. We're going to do this thing where each book is going to be so fundamentally different that you're going to be able to say, here are the merits to it, even if it wasn't as for me as this book is.
I love how aggressive you are. You really, and I love it. I'm inspired by it because obviously you have to be aggressive. You have to be an aggressive person to take care of this creativity inside of you. And the fact that you are your own best advocate, that you're going to push forward. And it's like a mama bear and her baby. I love it because
protective.
Yes, but you have to be, you can't just be an open book. And if you let it go by the wayside, our creativity never wants to show its face, right? It's scared all the time.
To your point, Felicia, I don't want to pretend like I'm not absolutely terrified whenever I sit down because sitting down to write a book like Addie LaRue, which is as different as possible from my most popular series, which is the Shades of Magic series, sitting down to write a book, knowing how different it was. Every time I sat down with that, a part of my brain said, you are making a sales mistake. You are creating a road that you are going to regret because you don't know that people will follow you when you know that they'll follow you over here. And so it seems like I'm very aggressive about it, but the aggressiveness comes from almost having my hopes validated, which is that every time I took the risk to write the thing that wasn't what I should be writing, but what I actively wanted to write and could be potentially different, every time it was rewarded by the readership who went on that journey with me and said, okay, we'll take that risk with you. And so I've been incredibly fortunate. But one of the reasons I was able to do that is from book one, when I went from book one to book two, they were different. Yeah. They were just completely different books. And when I went from 3 to 4, because I changed series, they were different. And so it's almost like cultivating in the readership a tolerance for change.
Yeah.
I'm trying to keep this in mind now as I'm working on the sequel to Legendborn, because it's as a debut.
And the second book is always awful. The process of the second book is always so horrible.
A lot of what I'm doing is cursing past Tracy. I'm like, why did you write so much book? Why did you do that? Why did you do this to yourself? That's on you. But I think it's a debut author, the influx of information and feedback that you're getting, because this is the like I've been creative before. I've done plays. This is the largest audience that has ever seen any one piece of my work, right? And so I'm getting all of this input, and then I'm also writing the sequel at the same time, and it's really challenging. And I've heard authors talk about it, but the experience of it, of being so sensitive to input right now, and I'm not like going to like, I'm not, Goodreads is blocked. It's not that, but it's, but just any input at all, I'm feeling it and hearing it. And the thing, even the things that people love, I'm like, that's great that you love it. But in my mind, I might not be focusing on that in that sequel. So I don't know. I feel like Victoria, Fonda, what are your words of wisdom for like sequel and keeping the noise, but also still making it different?
Yeah. I mean, the one thing that I managed to keep in mind, well, first of all, I blocked Goodreads as well. That was a life decision that I do not regret at all. 100% recommended to absolutely every author. But I would also say that I had to remember that like every installment of this series has to be its own thing. And like, it's not, if you get too caught up with like, well, this is what worked in the first book and I'm going to continue doing that, you're going to be pulling on threads that get thinner and thinner. So the biggest thing that I kept in mind was always like, this story has its own identity. And like the first book is like backstory or canon. Like in a way, writing the second and third book almost feel like writing fan fiction of your own work, because like you have a sandbox, right? And now you have locked yourself into that sandbox. But you almost have to like put it aside a little bit and be like, okay, that was the first book and like it's in print now, so that can't change. But now I'm going to write something that has its own identity, and I want to preserve the heart and soul of what made the first book what it is. But the second book now has its own arcs, you know, its own conflicts and all that. And now, you know, I'm currently in the thick of revision on the third. So each book has its own like anxiety, because you're like, well, the first book is super hard. You know, it's like, that's the book that like nobody knows about it yet. And the second book, you worry about saggy middle syndrome. And the third book, you're like, oh, if I don't stick the landing, the whole thing is going to fall apart. So like each
sounds awful.
you're going to have anxiety over every book. Like that's the thing.
Anxiety, it just changes flavors.
It just changes flavors. It's just like the constant miasma. It just like kind of changes color.
Yeah.
What I will say, Tracy, is like something that I feel like it took me too many books to learn or to intuit, is that you cannot write a book to please everybody. Yeah. There's no such thing as a book to please everyone. And so what you have to do is write a book to please you, because you are audience of one. You are the first reader, the first fan, and the first critic. And the more you write with yourself as that pinpoint, with yourself as the guide, not what anyone else wants to read, but what you want to read.
Yeah.
Like, what is the story you want to read as much as the story you want to write? You will find that authenticity and that love is what attracts the readers to it, rather than trying to take in any of the information about what readers say. Oh God, I hope this thing happens in the sequel. I really want more of it. Like, don't listen to that. That's their fan fiction box, right? But like, you're writing what you wish you could read.
Right. It's so hard when you have so much input. And like I said, that success is almost a curse in a way, because if you get it too early, you don't get your training wheels off, you know, in a sense. Like you really, for me, like one of the first things I ever wrote became very, very successful in screenplays. And like the anxiety of not being able to duplicate that and having the pressure of all of it was still something that plagues me to this day. And so the greatest thing is to get as much under your belt that you know the core of yourself, right? And you can express it. Not that I've ever written a second book, but I have written a lot of things that were very agonizing. And, you know, what is the worst thing if you create from joy versus like the grind, right? And that's something I do all the time in anything I do. It's like, oh, how can I enjoy this? Because I really hate this right now.
Well, and you know this, Felicia, like in your industry too, is like, you will never have control over what is successful that you create. Like, you will never get to pick what is the most successful, what is the best received, any of it. That feels so arbitrary. So all you can control is the joy that you experience while you're creating it.
Exactly. Right. That is the core of it. We have several really good questions.